characteristics of the wildlife that are found on the estate. There's quite a range of characteristics of the species that are there based on the history of the site. I'm then going to give you a bit of a tour of the species, some of the highlights that can be found on the estate, what we're doing to help those very species, and talk about our future plans. So to get straight into it. The current name of the project I'm working on is Biodiversity Means Business, and it's all about linking up nature conservation with economic activity. We have to accept it's an industrial estate. It's a very economically productive place. It employs a lot of people on the edge of one of the most populous parts of North Wales. But it's a place with real biodiversity interest. There's a lot of species of conservation concern live there, and we can work with the businesses and bring both sides together to achieve positive outcomes for all. So the Wrexham Industrial Estate is one of the Wildlife Trust's living landscapes. The Wildlife Trust operate living landscape projects, not just in Wales, but right around the UK. And it's a it's an acknowledgement that nature reserves in their own right aren't enough. We need to do more than just protect the best bits. We need to get the rest of the countryside also working for nature conservation as well. There are over 100 of these living landscapes now around the UK. Almost all wildlife trusts operate landscape projects. And the North Wales Wildlife Trust run 4 of those, mostly in the east of the region, but one on Anglesey as well. They are the Allen and Wheeler project, so focused around Hauck and Mould sort of area. The Anglesey Fens over in the west, this is the project I used to work on. The De-Invasive Non-Native Species project, which has, I think, fairly recently been incorporated as a living landscape project. So they operate right throughout the watershed, removing species like Himalayan balsam and Japanese knotweed. And then there's the Wrexham Industrial Estate, which has been operating since about 2014. So we've been working in the area a little while now and had a chance to have some real positive impacts on the estate. But the mantra of living landscapes, why do we do it? What's it all about? Well, we restore them. We restore habitats, places like ponds, wetlands, forests and meadows. We recreate, so places that used to be perhaps forests, we will replant, or where opportunities arise, we may replant forests and hedgerows and things like that. And then we also reconnect them. So wildlife corridors are a real theme of living landscapes, and we can work to improve connection of important wildlife sites, because if a site gets fragmented, cut off from other sites, species may die out and then are unable to recolonize. So reconnection is important. I've got a quote here for why nature conservation is important in the Wrexham Industrial Estate in particular. And it's from Chris Baines, the well-known television presenter and author. I think he was involved in launching Countryfile quite a few years back now. But he said, nature on the doorstep is good for people, and it is also very good indeed for business. So we are not just saving species, we are making the health and well-being of the people who live and work on the estate better. We're making it more biodiverse, easier to access, running events and more. So the estate itself, from fields to factories. Let's look at the location. So it lies just within Wales. Any further east and I'd probably have to work for the Cheshire Wildlife Trust. But as it is, it's just in North Wales, which is good. Geographically, it's right on the edge of the Cheshire Plain. As you go west, beyond Wrexham, the lie of the land suddenly rises up onto the moors around Rwabon. And then just to the east of the estate is the Dee Valley SAC, or Special Area of Conservation. This is a European designation that gives the Dee Valley special protections for nature conservation. And it lies next to Wrexham City, the biggest area of population in North Wales. So there's a closer view of where the industrial estate lies within North Wales. And there's a satellite image. So that shows Wrexham just to the west, and that's where a lot of the workers live who work on the estate. And then further east, you can see the meandering River Dee in the valley there. This is largely a very flat area with farmland surrounding the estate. Looking at the history of the area, you go back to about, I think, the 1500s, around then. The area was dominated by parkland, so mature trees, but fairly sporadic, with open areas in between woodlands and things like this. And they were used for medieval hunting parks. There's one, well, there's a few around Wrexham in particular, one which pretty much encompasses the industrial estate, Abanbury, but there's also other medieval parks like Kevin Park, which remnants of it still exists. And then in World War II, the landscape changed fairly dramatically, and sort of this gave rise to sort of the layout of the industrial estate as we see today, when the area was used for the ROF in World War II to make munitions, and the site, so it wouldn't be bombed, was all spread out, and they had the different units all over the place. But many were disguised as agricultural buildings in an effort for them not to be bombed from the skies or spotted in the first place. And a remnant of that still exists today, with some farm buildings still in the heart of the industrial estate, such as Abanbury Farm here. So there's a close-up of the hunting parks. This is quite an old map, so you can see the Dee and its tributaries. And then a close-up of the factories. Because they were spread out, this gave opportunities for species to make their homes sort of in between the buildings. There were nice patches of wilder areas, despite this being a very important site in World War II. And then jumping to the modern day, there are now over 300 businesses that operate on the estate, 7,000 workers. It's one of Europe's largest industrial estates, and it covers an area of 500 hectares, but there's talk of that growing a little bit more in time. And then a closer view. This was taken by a colleague of mine with his drone, and it gives a wonderful overview of the estate. And you can see sort of in between the large expanse of white roofs, there's lots of corridors with trees. What you can't see there's quite a few corridors as well for wetlands, so ditches and streams, and even a river on the south side of the estate. So the opportunities for wildlife are quite extensive. It may not be a completely green area, it's fairly urban, very urban you might say, and but the legacy of the past and modern day practices have given rise to lots of spaces. And you can see on the right here, this green infrastructure map. So this is a map that the Wildlife Trust commissioned to assess all the green spaces on the estate. So they could be fields, they could just be mowed grass, hedgerows, rivers, woodlands, all those, all combined into one map. And it actually shows there's a lot of spaces that are good for wildlife. Brownfield sites are very biodiverse. I'm going to talk about that shortly, why that is. But it's very basically due to a large range of habitats, what we call a mosaic of habitats in a small area that allow a lot of different species to live alongside each other. The team of the project is myself. I'm on the right there in that photo, and my colleague Lawrence Maxwell. And this photo was taken by a volunteer who's worked with us on the project quite a bit, called Mark. He lives very locally, so he's great to have along. And these projects do thrive thanks to volunteers. And it's not only nature that benefits, but they benefit too. People learn new skills, they get out and about, and the fresh air and exercise that comes with volunteering as well in the outdoors. My manager, Adrian, also works on the project, some of you may know. But we've had students help us as well. We can tailor projects for students so they can get involved at a level that suits them for whatever standard they're up to. But we also undertake works with contractors and our partners on the project, whose logos are at the bottom there. So this project heavily relies on working with businesses, and building relationships with businesses is very important. There's a selection of their logos on the right there of some of the businesses we've worked with, but there's many more as well. Getting to know the staff there and finding the right people who have the ambition and see the same vision as us with the opportunity they have on their grounds. But there's everything from pushchair makers, bakers, forest school, who we've been in touch with recently, and farmers in the wider landscape. So the core of our work really is habitat work. We do this work to improve the habitats so that more species will be able to move around the landscape and breed, basically. And we work to restore wetlands, so ponds. See a picture of a digger up there working on a site fairly recently. Tree planting, hedge planting, picnic areas for staff, which is actually a growing area of our work given the circumstances at the moment with the pandemic. Getting staff into the outdoors is a safer place for them to be, and we can help businesses do that, but in a way that's good for nature also. So the species on the estates, this is the sort of main focus of today's talk, but also kind of the fun part of it when we get to go out and survey for species that's just wonderful to see. And this photo is the Grizzled Skipper butterfly that Mark mentioned in his introduction. This is a nice photo, but in reality it's a very small butterfly and it zooms around the grasslands, so it's actually quite hard to see. Some of the species on the estate are threatened, and Grizzled Skipper falls in that category. It's a species that likes an open mosaic of spaces so it can move around, but ironically, if there's no intervention and habitats grow up and all turn into scrub and forests, then there's not the open places they need. So this species has benefited from the activities on the industrial estate, but requires some more work from us to keep areas open for it. And we run events. This is done for lots of reasons, several of which I've already mentioned, but also it spreads the word and gives us a presence on the estate. We want as many businesses as possible to work with us, and so we connect with them through events and other ways of engaging. So, onto the characteristics of the wildlife. What makes the wildlife on the industrial estate so special? So firstly, it's because they are specialists. A lot of specialists there that rely on what we call early successional habitats. So open spaces that you don't tend to get in the wild very often. So brownfield sites where there've been buildings and they've been demolished nice and open, and that is particularly good for invertebrates. This is a species of ruby-tailed wasp, of which there's a couple of specialist species within this small group of insects that are brownfield specialists. The mosaic habitats, which I mentioned, this image here is another drone shot over part of the estate. And here you can see open areas, woodland, roadside verges. There's a lot of different habitats in a small area. The characteristic of the species that do well on the estate is they are adaptable. So they make the most of a short-term opportunity quite often. So the bee orchids can quite randomly just pop up in a road verge one year. And so long as that road verge isn't cut during the summer, they get a chance to flower. And that's something we talk a lot about with businesses. There's the at-risk characteristic of species there. So lots of them, because they're depending on a very specific habitat, if that habitat goes and there's not much more of it, they're at risk of dying out. So by increasing the range of habitats and keeping them in good condition, species like the Grizzled Skipper there can thrive. They're biodiverse, partly because of some of the reasons I've mentioned, but as well as brownfield habitats, there is also ancient woodland on the estate. So this is another very biodiverse habitat. And some of the species are charismatic. And a lot of the people who work there don't realise that some of the UK's most loved species, for example, the badger, can be found around their offices. And we are trying to sort of raise their awareness of that by leading events and, even talks and things like that. So we can get people out and about more when it's safe to do so. And I like this quote, so I thought I'd include it. Mentioned in a Bug Life report, and it is mostly referring to insects, but it says the diversity of some brownfield sites is only equalled by that of some ancient woodlands. And that really did surprise me when I first read that, just how much diversity in the wildlife there can be in what are fairly human landscapes. So for the main part of my talk, I'm going to tell you a bit about a selection of species, because I can't talk about them all as much as I'd like to. So we're going to look at some of the real headline species on the estate, some of the ones that are much loved but quite often threatened, and species where we can help by managing habitats for them. So the first is the Grizzled Skipper. This is a priority on the estate. It's probably one of the better known species on the estate. It's not colourful, but it's got a really nice dappled pattern on the wings. It stands out even more than another relative skipper, the dingy skipper, which is also found on the estate. And one of the reasons it's a priority is it's the most northwesterly colony in the UK. It's at the edge of its range here, and so is perhaps vulnerable to changes here more than in other areas. It favours the sparse habitats that an industrial estate can offer. So when a unit is knocked down, and if the concrete pad is left, there will be gradual colonisation, and we might see the species the Grizzled Skipper needs to feed on start growing there. And we are working with Butterfly Conservation, one of our partners, on priority sites, which I'll talk about in a second. So we're monitoring the butterflies by establishing a program of monitoring. This is something we're looking to get people involved with to take on longer term. They can take on a site or as many sites as they like and report back to ourselves or COVNOD, the local record centre, or Butterfly Conservation as well. And from that, we are able to prioritise sites to work on. So go to this map here. The blue markers are sites I think we've recorded Grizzled Skipper on. And then the red markers are sites we think they could occur on in the future. And more monitoring is needed to assess that. So you can see there's quite a good spread. But the blue dots are mostly focused on the sort of southeast side of the estate, where some large sites that were formerly used that are now open, providing some of the bare grounds the butterfly and the food plants of the butterfly like. So as well as monitoring, we're also working to help them directly through managing habitats for them. So we're giving them this mosaic of habitats. We're giving them the shrubs they need to sit on and rest on and take shelter in. And we're clearing other areas within that, so they've got the open areas for the food plants. We are also adding in limestone aggregate. If I go to this picture here. So this is one site we've worked on called Hauck. It's a German name, it's a German company, and there was quite a bit of scrub on this site, which there's still some further back. We've left areas, but we've kind of reset this site, so we've restored it to this early successional stage. And then we're going to plant that up with plug plants. So these are some of the species that the butterfly likes. Agrimony, cinquefoil and strawberry being three of the favourites. And in this way we hope to help the Grizzled Skipper spread. On to bee orchids. This is one that's the wider public excited. It's another characteristic species of the estate, but if you look closer, that flower is exquisite. And surprisingly though, it doesn't get pollinated despite putting all that effort into the flower. The bee that naturally pollinates it isn't present in Wales, or I think the UK for that matter. Fortunately, I think it can self-pollinate, so we do find new colonies popping up here and there, but just as quick as the orchid appears, it can also disappear. One way we can help this species is by not mowing our verges, and that extends to our gardens as well, but on the estate we manage quite a few areas of verges. So during the summer, we can either individually mark them and go round them, or preferably we leave a whole wildflower verge, and that helps a whole range of species. So this is the leaves of the bee orchid that you see early in the season. Quite distinctive, but around it you've also got things like yarrow and oxeye daisy waiting to come up. So this verge now is looking rather nice. And the plants are just starting to come into flower on the estate, so now is a good time to go looking for them. One of the other priority species on the estate is the great crested newt. They are the rarest of the 3 newt species in the UK, the others being smooth newt or common newt and palmate newt. It is a European protected species, so this is about as protected as you can get. It's also protected under UK law, under the Wildlife and Countryside Act, so that any work we do to help them requires a licence, even if we're just trying to help them. It often requires a licence. But that level of protection does mean their ponds are well protected on the estate. And when businesses look to develop sites, surveys quite often have to be undertaken. And in the longer term, this can benefit the species. If a site is developed, they can build or create habitats elsewhere, or hopefully on site or nearby, so that there is replacement habitat for the newts, known as mitigation sites. Here's a closer view of great crested newt, showing the characteristic crest down its back. This is quite a tall crest, and then it dips down towards the tail and then rises again at the tail. It's, the overwhelmingly obvious thing is it's a large newt. It's much bigger than smooth or palmate newts, quite often sort of double the size. And it's got this fantastic orange and black spotted underside. There's a lot going on, and they remind me of mini dinosaurs. They're superb. So what we're doing for the newts, we have a plan to install amphibian ladders. And this is because when newts migrate to their breeding ponds, they can cross the road, and if they survive any traffic, they can end up falling in drains, and especially when drains are aside a curb, and the curb's quite hard to climb up and over, the drain might seem the obvious place for a newt to end up. So these ladders have been designed to help them climb back out, basically. And it will help the newts in the early spring period, in particular when they're moving to their breeding ponds, of which there are lots on the estate. Surveys in the past have revealed that dozens are falling in, and sometimes that involves manually collecting them and moving them to safety. But we're looking for a longer term solution that isn't so intensive. And these ladders are actually quite low cost and simple to install, just attaching to the side of a drain there. But we need to get permission, of course, from the council, which is something we are working on at the moment. But we're hopeful because this has been done in other parts of the county of Wrexham with good success. And in this picture, there's a couple of toads, I think, sort of on their way to climbing out of the drain. So, as well as progressing the ladders, we directly restore habitat for newts in the area. So just off the estate is a local community called Marchwiel, and there's a marsh on the edge of the village there, which has been untouched for quite a few years. As well as helping the newts, we got in there and done a whole suite of works to help wildlife. We've cleared and repaired a boardwalk so people can visit. We've thinned trees that were encroaching, and their leaves were basically filling up the ponds very quickly, so we've opened the ponds up. And we've dug them out and enlarged them so that in the future there's going to be increased habitat for great crested newts. It's worth adding that for every pond we dug out, we left a percentage of the habitat that was there, so if there were any in the ponds, they would have some shelter. And there's a view of the scene that met us when we came to the site. It's a lovely place. but it needed a bit of opening up to make it continue being good for nature. There is a pond there in the foreground which was almost sort of drying out altogether because of so many plants and detritus in there. And that's the view after the work. So this was opened out to a nice depth, which will be good for the newts to breed in. One of the other nice things about this site is it's adjacent to a school, so we hope to get school groups visiting the site again in the future once it's safe to do so. And finally, mitigation sites. This is a way through the planning process that a net gain for biodiversity can be achieved. So that is, more ponds can be created when there is development than there were before, and hopefully the quality of those ponds is good. And that has to be followed up quite often with surveying, which ecologists undertake. So at this site here, this is on land owned by Village Bakery, and it's a mitigation site for a development they're doing at the moment. They're putting in a new unit, but they created some ponds, and these are really good now. They're for newts. I'd say they're in their prime. There's some nice vegetation to hide in and attach their eggs to. There's also a nice depth, so the water stays a relatively stable temperature. And these now have good populations of newts, so this particular mitigation has worked quite well. And we speak to businesses about a mitigation when they're looking to develop sites. We have to accept that's going to happen in this area, but it can be done sensitively for the wildlife that's there. On to swifts. Now, I have to admit I'm a bit biased. These are probably one of my favourite birds. And it's actually one that's not found in many places around the industrial estates. They're more often to the west in the communities on the edge of Wrexham, around Hare Park and places like that. But this is a species we really need to help. It's amber listed now, so it's of conservation concern. It's declined by 69% in Wales alone since 1995. So that's over 2/3 gone in 25 years, which is not long really. It's a blip of an eye in terms of nature. So they've got serious problems, but it is a bird that really deserves our attention. They are record breaking. It's one of the fastest flying species in the world. In fact, other members of the swift family have been recorded flying at over 100 miles an hour on a level surface, on a level plane, sorry. Even our common swift has been recorded flying at over 70 miles an hour. So the speed you can go on a motorway, which is quite phenomenal. This is a bird that even mates on the air. It does everything in the air other than nest. And I'm pretty sure if it could nest in the air, it would do so, but yeah. So we can help this species by putting up nest boxes. They would have traditionally used holes in roof spaces, but as building stock sort of becomes modernized and wooden soffits and fascia boards are replaced with plastic, they have less and less nesting sites. So this is something we can really do, and it's something we've been doing on the industrial estate fairly recently actually, which I will talk about here in a case study. So the site I mentioned earlier, Hauck, they have a fairly large unit, and they've given us the go-ahead to put up boxes, which is great. They were due to go up, and then the pandemic hit, so our work's been delayed somewhat there, but they'll be up later in the summer the next season. So hopefully the birds will sort it out this season before they go, we'll have to see. But to encourage them to sites where they've not bred in the area before, we'll need to install a sound system playing their calls, and that'll lure them into the area. So there's a closer view of the unit. You can see it's got this corrugated facing, which is a problem for putting up boxes. So we're going to have to put a back on these boxes because if you go to the next picture, they are open backed. Normally they just go straight onto a wall. But these are really nice boxes. They're made from fiberglass and they pretty much have a lifespan. They don't give you a lifespan on them because they expect them to last forever. So the swifts are going to be well looked after. The brown hare is a species that lives in the sort of margins of the industrial estate and into the wider countryside. And whilst our work focuses on the industrial estate itself, we do things in the wider countryside, here, there, and everywhere as well, because it's all connected. So we monitor brown hares at a few sites, thanks to the involvement of students, actually. They help set up a programme where walks are done every year to detect how many animals are in this any particular area that's being surveyed. And from that, we can try and undertake habitat improvements, things like hedgerow improvements, but a lot of it comes down to guiding landowners how to look after their land in the best way for hares. So they're vulnerable to high-intensity farming. The young hares, known as leverets, will often hide in scrapes out in a field, and silage production in particular is harmful to them, so early cuts of grass could have negative consequences for the hares because they just don't move out of the way quite often. But some will take cover in hedgerows, and then nice thick hedgerows give them space to shelter. So a case study for how we've been helping brown hares is at Commonwood, which is to the north of the industrial estate. But there's an area of fields which are managed in a very traditional way. You can see, compared to the fields outside this sort of rectangle sorts, the fields are more how we'd expect modern fields to be. They're large, not too many hedgerows. And then you've got this traditional field pattern where the fields are known as pieces, and the local community can rent them out almost like an allotment, but they have to manage them in certain ways. And this method of management has actually been pretty conducive for the hares. It's been good for them, and they've done well here over the years, thanks to the density of hedgerows and the relatively low intensity agriculture that occurs here. So this is a view on the ground, taken on a survey that happened just before lockdown. And this actually illustrates one of the hedgerows that I would say isn't particularly good for hare. It's quite heavily trimmed, and although it'll grow during the growing season, it just doesn't give a lot of space for hares to shelter, and other birds and animals for that matter. Whereas we'd like to encourage more of the sort of tenants there to manage their hedges in a more wildlife-friendly way. So they've got more structure. They're broader at the base, they're taller. Whilst that doesn't help hares, it helps a range of other birds. And whilst I was there was long-tailed tits and bullfinches moving through the hedgerows. So we want more of these, really. And if we can also get in wider margins to the fields that aren't mowed, that would be good. So moving on to one of the other headline species on the estate, this is the common clubtail dragonfly. And this is a specialist of large river systems in the UK. They're found along most of the largest river basins, so the Thames, the Severn, the Wye, with a distribution that runs from the southeast of England just up into North Wales along the Dee. And that's as far as they stretch in the UK, so we're quite lucky to have this population, and this is a species we've been helping. You've got a male up here, which quite often a sort of steely blue colour, but they can be yellow as well. And you can see how they get their name, the Clubtail, which is this swelling of the abdomen towards the rear end there. So it's like a club. And then a view of the female. Pardon me. Again with a clubtail, but not so much. So we've been helping this dragonfly firstly by collecting records. We need to know where it is and how it's doing year on year. And we do that by liaising with the British Dragonfly Society. They've undertaken surveys with us before, and we often run these as events to get groups of people out so we can all learn what the dragonfly looks like, where they like to sit out, because we tend to look for these adult forms. They only spend, I think, a few weeks of their life as an adult. Most of their life is spent underwater in the shallow waters around the gravel beds of the river as nymphs, where they are voracious predators. And we also undertake riverside tree planting to help the common clubtail. So the surveys that we do this to monitor populations. We report that to the British Dragonfly Society, but also to the local records centre. And then the pandemic hit, and we thought, well, we don't really want to miss out on an entire year of records, but we need to try and get records in a safe way. And so one of the best stretches of the River Dee for this species is by the villages of Farndon and Holt. Holt just on the Welsh side of the river. And so we put up these posters and have had a really good response to them from people just on their daily exercise. So we weren't encouraging them to go out of their way or anything. And we've had quite a few records in of that. So that's been really good. Shows the dragonflies around in reasonable numbers this year. And after emerging, they sort of hang around the riverside and then move further away to woodland areas to rest up. But a large part of the work has focused around awareness through the surveys that I just mentioned, but also through this sculpture, which is on the banks of the Dee at Holt. If anyone goes down there, eventually you can have a look at it for yourself. It's a whopping sculpture, and this was put in a couple of years ago, and yeah, I think it's become well known by the local community now. You quite often see children clambering on it and things like that, which is fun. But that was also combined with an information board, so there's a lot more information for people about the insects, and we do see quite a few people reading this, so it really works. But we also lead guided walks, often disguised as surveys, so we achieve two things for the price of one. So one of the species that we're helping that's not an animal is a plant, is the black poplar. This is a really rare tree in the UK. There's only thought to be about 600 mature females left. The females are important in this species because they are dioecious, which means there are separate male and female plants. The males help pollinate, but it's the females that will spread the seed around the landscape. The reasons why it's such a rare tree are actually quite hard to find out. So part of my understanding is partly based on suspicion as much as anything, that black poplar produces a very nice wood, and so was heavily used for things like floorboards in house building and things like that. But there's also an additional threat, and that is loss of genuine black poplar trees due to hybridization. So crossbreeding with an American tree that's quite similar. I think it's called a cottonwood tree. And so the prevalence of hybrids in the landscape is quite high now, and so finding these genuine black poplars quite hard, and you've got to look quite closely at the leaves. Here are the close-up of the leaves, quite a distinctive pattern. Also the bark's quite distinctive, it's got this sort of deeply grooved pattern. So if you see a pattern a bit like that, you might suspect you've either got a hybrid poplar or a black poplar. And also the structure of them, they can form very large trees, and they do favour riverbanks. As you can see, there's a river in the background to this one. So it's a species, though, because there's very few left, the remaining specimens are very old and often quite gnarly now. And this is a view of a female black poplar, and it spreads its seed through the air, and it uses sort of this, creates this cotton effectively to help carry seeds through the air. So you can get huge areas covered in this cotton, which not everyone likes, but it's very distinctive. So we're helping to build up a database of black poplar trees in the region. The Dee Valley and on the Welsh and Cheshire side of the river is quite an important area in the UK for them. This has largely been done thanks to volunteers who've looked up what black poplars look like. We have ID sheets available for people who want to get involved with that. And they have gone out recording, and we now know there's up to 60 specimens in the area of the industrial estate, but potentially less now, because some of those records were from a number of years ago, and they could do with revisiting to find out if the trees still stand. But particularly we ask people to look out for the mature females for the reasons I mentioned before. So when it gets to this stage of the trees being widely spaced, there's a concern they may be too widely spaced for cross-pollination to occur, which can affect their chances of reproducing. And we ask people to put all their records on COVNOD, the local records centre. So a case study for how we've been helping the tree, in addition to surveys, is actually planting new ones and giving them a kickstart. But it's important we get stock that has a good genetic background or provenance. So we have liaised with Chester Zoo over this, who have a breeding programme for the black poplar. And they have thankfully given us specimens to plant. So these in the photo are on the banks of the River Dee in Holt, and they were put in a few years ago, but unfortunately we had that very dry summer in 2018, and we lost a few specimens during that drought, despite being in fairly wet ground. So it's quite an awkward tree, has to be said. But thankfully some survived, and we'll keep an eye on those, and we'll look to increase the number we have in the living landscape over time. But with all the recording that's gone on and all the time we've spent on the industrial estate, there's often a surprise or two, and I wanted to share one of those surprises with you. So we've had camera traps out in quite a few locations on the estate to monitor for certain species. Quite often they're put out by rivers and streams, so we can look for things like water voles or the presence of invasive species like mink. But we weren't expecting the following. Let's hope this video works. Fingers crossed. There you go. There's a video of an otter, pretty much an apex species for wetland habitats. A really good sign to see, top of the food chain, and dependent on a healthy wetland system. So there must be plenty of fish in them for the otters to eat. So this was a really nice surprise, and just goes to show with this type of recording, using sort of passive techniques like camera traps, we can capture some really interesting records. So yeah, it's a strategy we're using in quite a few places, and that way we can collect some nice records. But it's that is just a tour of about, what was it, 8 priority species. It's not possible to talk to you today about everything we're doing on the estate, but that's just a selection of some of the best species that can be seen. Just to talk about a few other examples of the work we're doing more generally for a wider variety of species. Here's a few examples. So there's one business working with called CIG Limited. And like a lot of businesses, they have a strip of land around their unit. And before we got involved, there wasn't a lot going on. A lot of businesses fall into that trap of thinking that only mown grass is beautiful, but we're here to present an alternative. And so by talking to the company and presenting to them our ideas, we've won a grounds maintenance contract to work there, looking after their grounds, but doing it sensitively for nature and actively improving it in some cases. So we've taken on wildflower meadow management. And as you can see in the photo, the top of the photo there is the meadow after a cut. So it looks like that throughout most of the autumn and winter, but then come the summer, it's just full of things like oxeye daisies and wonderful for flowers and invertebrates. We've undertaken a light bit of tree thinning. There have been some historical tree planting there, so to allow some of the specimen trees to become more mature, we did that. And then we planted a hedge, which is a useful way to connect different areas of habitat. We always go for native hedges, so that it's best for a large range of species. And then we also looked at the sort of we sort of went, what does the area need for people? And in a limited space, we decided to put in a picnic area. And it's not your average picnic area. I've not got any photos, unfortunately, but we built some gabion cages and filled them with limestone gravel. Limestone forms the bedrock of a lot of the food plants the Grizzled Skipper butterfly likes. So we're going to plug plant into this picnic area the food plant for the skipper. So hopefully we'll combine good habitat for the butterfly and good habitat for people too. I've mentioned Holt a few times. We've had really good links with the community council there, but also the Gardeners Club, Plant Life and others to talk about a number of areas that we can manage. It's quite near to the industrial estate. It's in a rural ward, so it's not far away at all. So we've worked on a number of sites. That includes a coronation meadow, hence our involvement with plant life. This is a plant life concept. And we manage a small meadow on the banks of the Dee, which is very rich in wildflowers. We also manage wildlife copse. So the bottom photo here is the copse, and it used to get completely cut on the understory. So a lot of the flowers wouldn't get a chance to flower and set seed and so on. So we changed the management over to just cutting a path, and this has allowed a profusion of campion, cow parsley, and even bluebells, which are starting to colonise the woodland. But also nearby, we've managed a range of wildflower verges as well. So this is a picture from one of the wildflower verges in the area, showing another bee orchid. There are other species of orchid available on the estate, but this is the one we most frequently bump into. I think there are pyramidal orchids as well as common spotted orchids. So there's a few different species to be seen. But overall, these are just a few of the roughly 700 species of plants that have been found on UK verges. So with the right management, and if they're not all cut through the summer, this could be a really important green corridor network for our wildflowers and also insects and other things. But we need to move away from verges getting cut 6, 7, 8 times a summer to doing the necessary cuts for safety, but in other areas only moving to a once or maximum twice annual cut. And ideally they take away the clippings as well. But we're talking to Wrexham Council about how we can continue to make improvements. But in the meantime, a lot of the businesses have their own verge, and these are starting to spring up in a few places on the estate where they're being left, especially for the wildlife. But given the current situation, I thought I'd include this clipping of an article in BBC News just talking about with the wildflower verges being left, just how many more wildflowers have been seen this year and appreciated by people. It's been really good to see social media overwhelmed at times with pictures of people appreciating their verges, but then sometimes frustratingly the after view of that same verge being cut. So we can all rally around making our verges better for nature. And then one of the other things we're doing, my final example in this section of the talk is Wildflower Roundabouts. And we have taken on 8 roundabouts this year on the industrial estate. And this isn't our sort of typical conservation. You might call it colourful conservation. But it really connects local people with what we are doing on the estate, and it helps us get out a message that nature is colourful, it's vibrant, and it can be in everyone's everyday lives if we let it in. So despite it being fairly high maintenance, we have to rotivate and seed these roundabouts every summer. It just gives this wonderful profusion of colour of native cornfield annuals. These are species that in the wider landscape now, thanks to intensive agriculture, are actually rather rare. You don't see poppies all that often anymore, so it's good they can be allowed a safe space to do their thing. But images have been going around places like Facebook, and the level of public interest in them is extraordinary. So it's been nice to help do this. So that's the majority of my talk. I'm just going to have a little look at our future plans for the area and how people can get involved as well. So we'd like to increase the number of businesses we work with. We've worked with over 30 businesses in recent years, but there are 300. There's almost enough for one for every day of the year. So more the merrier, and I think with a growing acknowledgement of issues like climate change and the ecological crisis that we are experiencing, we can get more on board, and it's good for them, it's good for their staff, it encourages more investment into the area and more customers into the area. So it's good for businesses and it's good for nature. We'll continue to improve opportunities for the priority species in particular. Focusing on those, we will install the habitats that not only they like, but a whole range of species like. And we want more people to get involved, whether that be through surveys, which can literally be a walk in the park, or practical work. If you don't mind rolling your sleeves up and getting stuck in with us on the ground, then there's something for everyone. But also events, and it's something we're looking to diversify the way we engage with people, such as today's talk. This is new for a lot of people at the Wildlife Trust, so we hope you agree this is a good way to get our message out to a wider number of people. So we'll continue, hopefully, making new discoveries. With more recording, we can uncover wild species and places that need conserving. And I've included an example here of a fairly innocuous-looking thing, although I've blown it up in terms of size, and it could potentially be quite scary, I suppose, at this scale, but it's tiny in reality. And this is a weevil, a rare species of beetle that lives on the estate and nowhere else in the estate in Wales. So this is a very rare species indeed, and it's nationally scarce within the UK as well. So it just goes to show, sometimes we have to look closer to find what's there under our eyes. But we'll continue doing that, and who knows what we can continue to find. There's an even scarier view of it. And then one of the legacies of the Living Landscape project, we hope, will be the opening up of nature reserves, but probably not formal nature reserves like the reserves the Wildlife Trust already maintain. These will be more informal sites. So there's a couple of examples here of sites that we're going to get officially opened during the year. First is Earless Black Wood, which is an ancient woodland right in the heart of the estate. It's remarkable that this is still standing, but there are trees there, oaks of really good age, and it's got a wonderful ground flora. It's also home to green woodpeckers breeding in the trees, early purple orchids, things like wood anemones form huge carpets in the spring, a real sight to behold. But as one fortunate turn of events was a forest school that we made contact with, who are going to use the site to take groups of school children out and get them in the outdoors, despite it being a very urban landscape. So I think that's fantastic. And we're going to do it in a way that's sensitive to the woodland. So the access that's going to be put in will kind of miss the biggest patches of woodland flora, but go fairly near them so people can still enjoy them. So as long as we do it sensitively, I think it's going to be good. And this is a site that Village Bakery own and have leased to us. So this is, I'm really pleased to be able to tell you all about this. And later in the year, we hope to have this site opened up for people to visit. And we'll ideally, should events allow, we'll undertake some surveys in there, which everyone will be welcome to join. There's a closer view of the woodland. You could honestly be in Sherwood Forest or some of the great forests of the UK when you're within this woodland. You just wouldn't know. And then the other site is the Hare Nature Park, which is an area of land we help manage. We don't lease this area of land, but the company Hare, who have a big unit on the estate, are happy to allow people onto the site. And it actually used to be, part of the site used to be a football pitch. So we are fast-tracking the rewilding of this site by planting trees, but also keeping a more open meadow area, and then we'll allow nature to take its course somewhat. And we are going to, as you can see, there's a path being put in around the site so people can take a nice loop trail. And this has public access already, actually, but we're going to improve that further during the rest of the year. There's a photo going through part of the wilder area. You can follow progress of the project and more of the work the North Wales Wildlife Trust does by following us on Facebook and Twitter. Also, you can visit our website, which can be found through the main North Wales Wildlife Trust page, and occasional updates through our weekly email, the Wild Weekly newsletter that we send out, for which there's sign-ups on the homepage of our website. So that just leaves me to thank Mark for inviting me. Despite being at the last minute, I was able to put this together for today. He does great work, and the whole of the Conway Valley branch do, as well as the other network of branches we have right around North Wales, putting on events throughout the year. If you're not a member of your local branch, do consider joining. They do all sorts, like I say. But also like to thank my colleagues. This is a team project. All the volunteers who help us achieve even more than we would do otherwise. Our partners, the businesses, and ultimately our funders. So thanks to all of those as well. That's the end of my talk. So thank you all. Thanks for listening.